Hey, everybody, how's it going? Welcome to another footnote. I'm doing footnotes now, I guess. Yeah, so the first one that I want to talk about. This is not going to be as, this one is not as, I don't think this one is going to be as clean as like the Steinberg one. Primarily because the Steinberg one I had already written the script out beforehand, but this one I didn't really have enough time to sort of like sit back and sort of like think it out. So this is just my thoughts off the top of my head. I know what I want to talk about, but I don't know exactly how I'm going to formulate it. So if it is a little bit rough around the edges, my apologies. But I do want to talk about this specific footnote, which is by acknowledging a hypocrisy. I want to acknowledge a sort of like hypocritical element in my video that I think I didn't intend for it to be that way, but it sort of incidentally ended up going in that direction simply because of that. And that is this idea of women otaku. And the thing is, a lot of my video talks about, or a lot of my video sort of talks about, well, sorry, not, there's a good section of my video which talks about, men otaku, male otaku, how are they like framed and understood. But then I say, it turns out that historically, women are sometimes, in terms of the ways in which we can measure this community, right? Women have always been there. They've sometimes in some spaces been dominant, and in other spaces they've been kind of equal numbers. And I say that, but then I spend most of the video talking about a predominantly male character, and so I want to explain why I did that, right? Because I think that's important, and that is my goal was not to like erase like women otaku, right? I mention it specifically because it was part of like a sort of a general narrative that is oftentimes understood by sort of normie or outsider cultures, and that in this context, female otakus are considered to be like sort of like outsiders or they're less discussed and so on and so forth. I think one of the reasons is actually an argument by Kaiichiro Morikawa in his very short article on otaku, which I will have in the sources in on the page. But in short, the idea was simply that like it's more clear to see men based upon like how they hung out in the clubs versus women how they hung out in the clubs. And I mean like clubs as in like school clubs. I don't mean that in like they're going out to the dance club. But the idea, right, is pretty simple, which is simply women are able to hide it a little bit better, in short. And I think that's kind of something that you will see in My Dress Up Darling, right? Which is that, like, that show, that show and that manga is just full of women otaku. Like, it's just full of them. And the thing is, like, they're so very, in my opinion, they're so very capable. They're so very capable of kind of like quote unquote hiding it. But that's not the case for all of them, right? Because like some of them do run up into quite a bit of friction. Some of the characters, so there's that kind of stuff. There's also the other element that I wanted to talk about, which is that there's also the other element that I wanted to talk about, which is that like, if I talked about women otaku, then that means I'm going to have to talk about Marin. And one of the questions, of course, is exactly, well, what would I really say about Marin? There's quite a lot. I think, especially in the context of performativity. Marin is very interesting. So when we're talking about performativity, right, there is this assumption. So one of the elements of performativity that makes it very interesting, but also kind of makes it a little like scandalous, right? Is this sort of, it sort of like eschews this idea that there is a sort of like truthful interior, and that instead of like under this assumption that we are like playing roles that we like choose to like put on, like we are doing what we actually are, like what we perceive ourselves to be, we are doing that. We are sort of acting and repeating set of cultural mores which sort of shape the way in which something happens, right? So there is no like, oh, I want to be seen as strong, so I am. So this is the thing that I think might catch a lot of people off, right? Which is that like there's a difference between performance and performativity. And performativity here, performance is like saying like, I want to see myself as strong. I want to project myself as being strong. So I'm going to sort of adopt all the trappings of like being strong, right? That I'm going to put on a mask of sorts and then say like, I'm going to go out into the world and I'm going to present myself as being strong, as being like one in particular kind of way. And what ends up happening, of course, is that like there's this assumption that when, you go home in something, right, you can take off the mask, or you can put on another mask and so on and so forth. There is the assumption of an interior, and that interior is sort of like moving all the little bits and pieces around. Performativity, however, goes even deeper than that by sort of removing the concept of that interiority in the first place by saying that like you are what you are doing. You are what you are doing, and what you are doing is determined by social, cultural, and political apparatuses all around you. And so what happens is sometimes you will run up into situations where these apparatuses are proposing or demanding a certain way of doing something, and then you don't feel like something is like working, that something's quote unquote wrong, that something's off. And so instead of just like taking off the mask and putting on a different mask, it's kind of like parceling and changing the way in which you are as a human being. That is sort of one of the implications of the performative relationship. So in this case, there is something really interesting about Marin. Marin is actually a really interesting character from a performative perspective because, she is not. If we take a look at it in the context of performance, we can think of Marin. We might think of Marin as like an otaku deep down, but like she like gives this like upbeat like Genki Gyaru like sort of like mask. She doesn't do that. She doesn't have to do that. And I think in this context, she's a very performative subject, because there is no like interior otaku where she's just like, oh, this is like the real me, right? And so like there are a lot of moments in the story where it really stresses that, when Gojo says like, this is the Kitagawa, like this is the Kitagawa-san I know versus, another Kitagawa-san that somebody else knows. One and the other are not necessarily subservient to another. There's no like real like Kitagawa that like sort of acts as a nexus that dictates the identity of all the other Kitagawas around him. She is becoming. She is like doing to become. And like her approach to otaku, it finds in this sense kind of a really useful bedfellow in a performative sense with her gyaru, with her like gyaru personality, because she is doing she is doing gyaru because she is gyaru. Those are interlocked. And in doing so, that shapes the way in which she is as an otaku. She is doing otaku. And so you can see how it sort of like plays out with a lot of other ones. And there is at the time of the manga right now, there is a character named Akira-san. And Akira-san is really interesting because there's not too much details about her right now. But she does seem to be a sort of more of a character who is grappling with a supposed interior, where she feels potentially like there is a part of her that she cannot truthfully or helpfully display out because she's very private. She seemingly hides her gender online, all that kind of stuff, right? She does present herself partly as how she seems to be online, this like cool, this cool person and all that kind of stuff. But she is very different from Kitagawa, from Marin, because Marin has no seeming interiority. She presents herself how she presents herself and how she acts is interlocked. And so I think there is actually a really useful and possibly valuable way in sort of understanding otaku, both in terms of the performative lens and also in terms of like how it depicts otaku females, primarily through that lens. I don't know exactly where it would be going, but this is also one of those situations where it's just like, if I do break down modding, right? Like, one of the things, of course, is that, like, if I break down modding as a character and then I say, okay, well, these are some of the things I'm noticing, then I think that's going to end up another like 20 extra minutes. And the problem, of course, is that that's going to lead to like a 40-minute video on like my dress up darling. And I already complain enough about people like not writing like short enough videos, so I didn't want to add to that the flame of that fire. So this is one of the things that I just wanted to mention. I know that there's something else I think I wanted to mention here, right? Yeah, there's also one of the things that I wanted to say, which is that a lot of discussion about female otaku does not necessarily like defang the sort of like, it doesn't defang the sort of toxic rhetoric that has been levied against otaku, because you can see some of this idea even levied against women, right? You know, like everybody talks about male otaku and how they're like creepy virgin losers and all that kind of stuff. But there's also, it is kind of wild that, like, for instance, the word fujoshi refers to rotten women, you know, and you might say, okay, well, that word can be reclaimed. That word is being reclaimed by certain groups, but the fact that, like, that is fundamentally an element that defines them, and it boils back to a sort of cis heteronormative Japanese understanding of sexuality. You know, it's like, oh, you know, these women are really into like boys love. Absolutely disgusting. You know, they are rotten women. And I think there's something really interesting about that, because if you want to contrast the depiction of women otaku in something like My Dress Up Darling, which was, you know, written and composed by a woman. There's also something interesting in another one, which is Kiss Him Not Me, which also concerns a female otaku. But she's very different because, like, there is something really strange about that show, because she starts off as like this slovenly fat. She starts off as like this slovenly fat, like gross character, and she essentially is the common depiction of like a female otaku, right? She's this gross, slovenly, like character that nobody likes and everybody kind of avoids. And then she like loses weight. You know, she loses weight. She gets, you know, she becomes prettier. And then everybody starts to fall for her. And then everybody starts to learn a little bit more about what it means. You know, they start to learn a little bit more about their hobbies. And it's sort of a very strange piece of work, because it kind of feels in some ways, and this is just a surface reading on my part of it, but it feels in some ways kind of like a female version of Densho Otoko, because Densho Otoko, the whole idea of Densho Otoko is that like this guy is like a kissless virgin loser, but you know, once he cleans up, you know, ladies, he's got a lot of money, he's actually kind of nice and all that kind of stuff, you know, you should give him a chance, but you gotta clean his ass up first. Kiss Him Not Me is actually kind of very similar in that, which is that like boys, you know, those female otaku, they're actually they might be pretty hot, you know, maybe it is fun having a little cute nerdy little girlfriend, etc., all that kind of stuff, right? Hang around her, see how it goes. And I don't think that's the intended message, right? But it does fall under the very similar lines, which is just that like they get to know her by her losing weight. And I think she gains that weight back on again later. If I could recall, she gains the weight back on again later. And I think part of the arc is that like she finds out who she really likes, because he still likes her even though she's gained back like the weight. But it is really weird that she gains that weight back, and then there's like, oh, I guess she's hot now. But, you know, it's really weird, because oftentimes it sort of makes this assumption. It's just like, okay, well, I know she's fat now, but she could be hot later, because I've seen her when she's hot. You know, like that's the sort of like mentality that I feel like it kind of comes up in that sort of situation. Yeah, I'm getting really off base now. Sorry about that. My apologies. Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge the hypocrisy in talking about like, you know, the otaku rhetoric and all that kind of stuff, but ultimately not really talking too much about about like women otaku in general, and I do want to apologize for that. And hey, you know, if anybody wants to make the women otaku focused like analysis of modern, there's actually quite a bit I think that can, you know, you can find that from this.